I would like briefly to talk about control systems so that we can be basically familiar with some of the control systems and norms that we're going to want to use whilst rigging a face. Because, of course, owing to the differences between body rigs and face rigs, much of it will be different. If we've done any body style or mechanical style rigging, then stuff like this should be, quite familiar to us, just a standard old IK chain as you might use in a limb or a mechanised arm or something of that nature. It's the standard IK setup that we see used again and again and again. However, on a face there are limited places where we can actually make use of something like this. That's not to say that it's, completely out of bounds and you should always look for solutions that don't include something like this. You use whatever works. Like anything in rigging, you identify a problem. You identify the kind of motion that you need to produce, you identify the kind of control that you want to give the animator, and you try to find a system and setup that fits the bill. You might find a place for this, I don't know, some scenario where you've got a fatter or flabby face that needs to bulge when a jaw comes down or something. Let's just imagine the head is upside down, shall we, and this with a throat and this with a point of the jaw, and then this is a big lump of fat that's under the chin, then maybe as the jaw is coming down, and this null could be parented to the jaw, as that's coming like that, it could press out, that lump for you. Or it could at least create a hook point here onto which to attach other deformers that would control that bulge for you. On top of that, of course, there's not to mention the fact that not all faces are human. You might have some weird creature or alien, or you might need a trunk. Elephants have faces too. But a lot of time in standard plain humanoid faces, as well as many others that broadly fit the approximately same anatomy, stuff like this doesn't have a huge calling and you won't really see it in these tutorials. What we will see much more of is stuff like this, stretchy bones. Of course, as we said when we're looking at face structure, we've got large areas of the face that need to push and slide and stretch and squeeze and so on. So stretchy bones like this that are able to just grab our face mesh and mush it about will be of great value and usefulness to us. As of course might certain control systems where we want to be able to pull on a controller and have it, automatically pull out, perhaps with other pieces along the way. Now there's one little interesting thing here on stretchy bones. You'll notice of course that this is, it's fully targeting the goal and it's stretching out to meet it, but it is of course only stretching on the one axis, right? In other words, the bone is getting longer, but it's not getting thinner. It's not a volume preserving bone. Now, the truth of that matter is that throughout pretty much the entirety of the face, that's often not going to be a big deal. We're going to be using these stretchy bones to move lines of skin around the face. But you might encounter characters where you want to have, some volume preservation going in. Who knows, maybe they've got a droopy antenna or dangly something or other, I don't know. And when it squashes down, you also want it to bloat out. I suppose also in human characters, you might want to put something like that, for instance, on the lips. So as the lips get stretched wide, they also get smushed thin. Usually not necessary, but it can be handy for some characters or situations. Since we won't be using that very much, if at all, in these characters that we're going to be doing here, let me just give you a quick heads up on how to do it should you need to. First of all, you can't do it with the regular constraints because you would need to set as the scale item the self item, which you can't do. You can't reference itself. So that leaves you with a couple of other options. First of all, you could turn to expressions, just referencing the Z channel. Problem is that, of course, the Z here is being controlled by IK, and expressions are operating on whatever is keyed into the channel. They only see what's in the curve. And as you can see, even though the scale Z is currently at 0.7 something or other there, over in graph it's still at 1 because of course it hasn't been keyed. That leaves us with some modifier or other, and the easiest is nodal. The way to do that is to get the stretchy item, in this case the bone itself, So here we have its scaling value. We can see using the probe that it is indeed picking up the value after the IK there. Get some other node to split it out so you've got X, Y and Z. Of course you're going to need to create an X, Y and Z to go back into the output of the scaling. And the Z will of course be whatever the Z is. But setting the X and Y, which just here in case you're wondering what happened to that bone, are by default 0. They just need to be some factor of Z. Now you can just make it up somehow, you can take 1 divided by Z, in which case as Z goes up, X and Y go down. However, if you want to get it, properly volume maintaining accurate, then get yourself a power node and a divide node. We take the Z, set the power to a half, which gives us the square root. And we simply take 1, so to the A position here, and we divide that by the square root of Z. And that becomes our X and our Y. You'll notice, of course, that nothing appears to happen ordinarily. That's because for this to actually happen properly, it needs to happen after IK. This gives us 2 more reasons to often avoid, this volume preserving bone here. Firstly, there's the fact that we need to use nodal motion or something. Expressions would be great because they're really fast to compute. Nodal motion is a little bit slower. If you've got a whole bunch of bones in the face that are stretching and you've got this set up on every bone, that's going to slow down your rig somewhat. But also, of course, it needs to happen after IK. If you've then got some other, constraint-based item that's trying to reference this bone, or some part of its scale property at least, because remember it's only the scale here that is being affected after IK, then it can't do it because, of course, this happens during the IK step. So although this is a handy trick to be able to do in certain places, we aren't going to use it in the setups that we will see, and yet we will be able to get great deformation effects even without it. But there's the secret to it if you do find yourself in need of it at some point. Of course, when it comes to automatic stretchy stuff, coupled with the fact that we're wanting, the face to be this interconnected system, right? Things span between different areas. Muscles and skin rolls off the cheek and under the jaw and stuff like that. One of the types of control setups that we'll use an awful lot is basically this. We've got just a null here, which as we can plainly see is a child of the camera, and it's constraining to the position of the light. As a result, when we move the camera, it falls somewhere between the two, and of course the same is true when the light is moved, so we get this bidirectional constraint that always holds this in the middle. Nothing here is actually stretching apart from, of course, the distance between these two items. What we're effectively doing is finding that distance and a nice, in-between place for it. And we can tweak how much that is either by the multipliers here, or of course from the stiffness setting. That also lets you do pretty much the same job. And if you're needing little tweaks, of course, from the, plus, minus adjustments there, that'll let you create little offsets within that halfway fitting. Very handy. Remember, of course, you've got this, which is the blend for it, and that's slightly different to multiplying the value of it, because this blends between its value and the keyframe. If you are, or your face rig winds up getting used by one of those animators who likes to key all items, and you've got the blend set to anything but 0 and 100%, and of course when you key the item it will wind up shifting because it's blending between its keyframe value and its constrained position. So keep little details like that in mind, but of course this will give us a control system that plays nicely with, of course, the kind of stretching and dual side anchoring that we need to create for things. And we'll see this little control setup used quite a bit, or at least variants of it. Lastly, let's also, of course, remember parent space when it comes to our controls. Here we've got a light, which is just a child of the camera, so obviously enough. Oh, basic of basics, it goes with the camera when it moves around. But this has an important ramification that, of course, wherever the camera is, whilst the world space of the light is changing, its actual local coordinates are, of course, those of the parent space. And so at 0, 0, 0, it's always on point with the camera. The way that we want to set up our face is to have, these on-face controllers, right? And these are, sometimes they're stuck in the mesh, like you know, these fellas here in the lips and whatnot, and sometimes we might choose to have them floating around on the outside like the old brow controllers that we've got there, or these, you know, major lip controllers that we've got kicking around, that sort of stuff, right? The thing is, as you know, you're animating and you go through posing a face and you wind up wanting to change from one pose to another, especially if you're doing some animation in something like a stepped pose to pose fashion as you're blocking out lip sync or whatnot, it can actually be more painful to try and move your controllers from their positions in one pose to the new position in perhaps a different pose, and it's just easiest to go back to base pose. Thing is, of course, if your controllers are just floating around in space, where is that base pose? Well, it's at 0, 0, 0. So what we do with pretty much every single controller is we want to create bases for them, because that way, of course, no matter what we've done with them, no matter how we've, you know, positioned or rotated them, we can grab them nice and easily and just hit reset value on whichever, you know, control points, rotation, translation, and we can get back to base pose nice and easily. Means a lot more nulls, of course. Every single controller has to have a second null. It means a lengthier scene editor and a lot more items to deal with as we're working, but at the end of the day creates a far happier animator. It also means that when we come to set up constraints and we want to look at the value of one item and use that to drive something else, it's easier to set the range, whether we're using an expression or a node or a constraint or whatever, because we're starting from 0 on both items. Of course, you don't have to do that when you are looking things up, and there might be items that either we don't need to base or we can't really be bothered because it's not a great necessity. And when you set up the constraint or the mapping or whatever else, you can just enter the appropriate values. But certainly there is an advantage to having things based at 0, so item A is starting at 0, item B is starting at 0, and then you can map the range of A onto B. And just figuring out the numbers you need to use is simpler. There's another effect that can be achieved from, you know, basing things off this way, and that's the fact that the parent axes, which is what we prefer to use if we can, because that, of course, is what are always recorded in Graph Editor. The parent axes of an item, of course, are constant with respect to the local rotation axes of the parent. So we can see here that that's forward in Z. It doesn't matter how I rotate the camera, I'm still only in Z on this item, its child. Another complication that we see with faces, of course, is lines of action. One of the best examples of this in the face is the corner of the mouth, right? I can pull the corner of the mouth out and up to form a smile here. The problem, of course, is when it's going sideways, it is going strictly sideways. Yep, it's not just out and up that it needs to come, because here it's just, you know, straight out. It's out, up, and of course back. That means having to animate in all three axes, and of course it means having to deal with your graphs in all three axes. What I really want it to do is I want it to sort of go off in that diagonal direction down the line of the cheek, roughly. By having a base under the item, I can pre-rotate the base such that the parent axis for this item is already pointing in broadly the correct direction. So if I just pull it back on Z and up in Y, then I've already got something that's more or less in the correct position, and I'm not having to tinker around with the X here to get it just right. Of course, when you're wanting to create detailed poses, you ultimately shall, because you just want the lip just that little bit further this way or that way, but it does create, again, much more ease when you are posing and animating to have things move by default on parent axis in their major directions of movement, essentially tangentially to the curve of the face. As a quick mention, one way to have things move along, you know, a curved surface, you know, one little setup control that we can perhaps take advantage of is a spline, because you can just, you know, make that into the shape of the appropriate curve, and then your controller, in this case a camera, but whatever, your null controller, can just roll along that. That's easier and more appropriate for some areas of the face than others, and for some controls in the face than others, but we'll see that in more detail later on as we move through. But sticking with this idea of parents and parent spaces and bases under controls, and here I've just got my light, which is a child of a null here. Another little trick in Lightwave that you can get away with is changing how things behave in viewport manipulation, especially in perspective, where of course you see that as I drag my light around, I'm getting quite big movements here. What's that? 4 mil, 20 mil. Little movements of your mouse actually produce quite big motions. The grid square size here, by the way, is 1 meter. Ordinarily, if you want to change that sensitivity, you just change your grid size, right? You come down to a smaller grid size and your tiny little mouse movements. Look at that, I'm now producing fractions of a millimeter. Faces, at least if you're building them to normal real world scale, they're not that big. Your head isn't a meter or two across. As a consequence of this, if you are using a larger grid size and you're trying to pose controls, they can easily just go flying off like that. Sometimes what seem like tiny mouse movements, rather than actually giving you nice, scaled control. One way to deal with this with, parent bases, you can see the sort of, movement I'm getting here just from a simple little mouse move, is to actually scale the parent. It's not going to be used for anything, right? It's just a base. So we can scale it way down. And the effect that we see that has is, look at that, huge mouse movements and tiny little motion coming out of this. So we can scale down parent spaces of controllers, and that gives us the effect of making the controller less sensitive to our mouse. So there we go. There's our roundup of some of the control systems and little tricks that we can put on those controllers, and how we can, have them set up as a matter of course that will make certain things on our rigs easier, as well as the details of some of the building block systems that we're actually going to use to construct these rigs out of.